me, and then I'm going to get rid of the intro song and get rid of the over cover, and it's us two on the stream. Eventually, we'll eventually see it on our side. This is a good delay test. It's probably quite a delay. It should be.
Yeah, it seems like it is.
I want it to be because I want it to, like build as much of it as it can.
Mm-hmm.
Or what kind? Yep, there it goes. So there it goes, went off the screen, and there we are. Boom. Okay, so a good solid 20 seconds of time on the delay.
When is it going to happen?
I don't hate that though. Man. It's more than Twitch. Twitch is usually 5-6 seconds. But Twitch has been very spotty, and then I have to go download the thing and upload it to Twitch, and I'm not going to do that. That's not what I'm about. What I am about, Brandon Johansson Elizabeth Bakersfield, what I am about...
Why are you giving out my full real name?
Full real name. I know, right? What I am about is talking about... For anyone that wants to look me up, it's Stephen Perry Kelsey. I live in Renton, Washington. Come at me. Feel free. And
meanwhile, there's someone that's not your name and someone else who's out there just having people show up at their door.
Right.
I know that's your actual name.
That is my actual name. That's my government name. You used to be able to find my phone number on the internet, just out there. Probably still can.
Well, that's good that's not there. Let's hope it's not. Let's hope not.
Yeah. I don't care. But nonetheless, what I do care about is encounter design, and what I do care about is this episode 5 of Quest Board Gaming, the VOD series. 5 times we've talked about tabletop shit. The VOD series from Dying of Exposure, Quest Board Gaming, is about all things tabletop, and in this episode we're talking about encounters and encounter design. How are you doing on this fine, balmy November 7th?
Doing just fine.
Yeah, just doing good.
Oh, I'm warm and cozy in my basement with my fridge playing a background for me. I should give a shout out to some beautiful art from Kurzgesagt. They don't sponsor me in any way, shape, or form, but I do love that fucking channel.
Yep.
It's good stuff.
And it's a good fridge poster. It's a good fridge poster.
It is a great fridge poster. And there's actually another one. I'll just tweak you over here really quick. You can see this one right here is beautiful as well. Mm. So good stuff from them. If you have a basement that needs art.
Brandon and I only stream from the finest of facilities. I have artwork from Home Depot's hose and garden section behind me.
He has engineering equipment behind him.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Landscaping and agricultural engineering.
Yeah, there. I just looked over and it just panned over on the thing. This delay is wild. I need to not pay attention.
I just need to not look at it too.
Yeah, just glance for chat. But nonetheless, episode 5, encounters. We like talking about different facets of TTRPG. A lot of it is through the lens of D&D and Pathfinder, as it's what both of us have played the most. But a lot of it is also through other encounter designs. And a lot of things are agnostic in what we're going to be talking about today. And so let's just jump into it, Brandon.
So I gotta ask you a philosophical question then. What would you define an encounter as?
This is what I would define an encounter as, if we're being system agnostic. And you can't truly be system agnostic because there are whole RPG systems that are based on essentially revealing a card that's an event, which is essentially structured like an encounter. But if we're being as broad as we possibly can be, in my mind, an encounter is any situation in D&D that requires you to use the mechanics of your character to interface with that scenario, that role-playing scenario. So you could, if you want to be very specific, go a role-play encounter and say You never roll a die, do a skill check, spend a token, whatever that system requires. Base it off some base level character stat. You could say that there's roleplay encounters like that, but I think generally when you say encounter, what you're talking about is utilizing some of the mechanics that are built into your character to interface with whoever your GM, storyteller, what have you, is putting in front of you. And so that does mean a lot of roleplay is roleplay encounters if you have to roll for a skill check or spend a token or a unit or check your stats and see if you can willpower over somebody else and stuff like that.
I would kind of get more into that. Like, when I talk about encounters, I also think about the purpose of an encounter. It's obviously a moment to show a portion of the story in which there are risks to take and resources to spend. I think those are like the two biggest pieces of anything when you're talking about an encounter. Like the pieces of an encounter are what risks are you spending or taking and what resources are being expended. I think those things are really important when thinking about an encounter being meaningful, because obviously if there's a risk, I mean, that's clearly the most important thing is any given scenario is like, if there's not some risk being placed, something being wagered in an encounter, then why even bother with the encounter? Why not just hand wave that moment and move on to the next thing?
I agree. A risk, even the inherent risk of a choice, right? And then resources spent, whether that be character skills, abilities, equipment that you have, any kind of number of thing that you can spend or put into use, if you will, of some kind. And so that means that almost all TTRPG, there are certain systems that do not do this, but almost all TTRPGs are constantly stacks of encounters. They can all kind of be broken up into encounters. There's certainly portions where the storyteller is the game runner is like narrating and monologuing and infusing it with context and stuff and describing, and there are absolutely like bits and stuff like that people do that kind of move off of that, but they're most of it is encapsulated in story blocks that are some sort of challenge of either social or mental or physical sort of accomplishment by the party, because that's how stories are told. That's why we invest in story. No one, unless you're, even a show about not even a Seinfeld episode about nothing, still has like a plot that's causing struggle to the characters in it. Not that anyone should watch Seinfeld ever, because it's bad and it ages poorly. It was always bad. It continues to be bad. That's my hot Seinfeld take. That's why I refuse to run a Seinfeld campaign for you, Brandon. I refuse.
I mean, I've been fighting you about having you run a live-action Seinfeld LARP, actually, where we just get together and act out Seinfeld's person.
I think that's fair.
For a long time. But I actually have a funny story that I'm going to segue onto really quickly.
Okay.
As you know, I regularly attend the regional burner festival here in Seattle. And there was a character there who helped me on my last day. And people have what's called burner names or playa names.
Yeah.
And his playa name was Jerry Seinfeld.
Oh my God.
And I'll tell you, he was a joy to have around because he was helping me tear down camp. And he's just like, I need something to do. Do you need help doing stuff? And I'm like, yes, I do. And he went on to tell nothing but like Seinfeld references nonstop for like 3 hours. But you know what? I was so deliriously tired from the night before that it was just this guy's energy of constantly having a new reference, a new thing to say every single time. I was just impressed with this guy's absurd wealth of knowledge on Seinfeld.
I think that's the right choice. I think that is well worth the cost of entry of getting them to help you tear down camp.
Yeah. So wherever you are, Mr. Seinfeld, thank you so much. You were a wonderful treat and a wonderful help towards tearing down camp at Deep Playa this year.
But let's get into encounters. So let's.
That was an encounter of my own.
That was an encounter for me, and I choose to walk away from it. I choose to run, run from Seinfeld. But that was an encounter for you. You had the risk of if you could put up with this Seinfeld character, but you were in the right headspace to take the wisdom damage, the psychic damage from it, and you passed your save, and it helped you accomplish tasks faster. And so everything is essentially, or almost everything in TTRPGs, is some form of encounter. And so let's break it down by category. And we're going to go easiest first, and we're going to talk about combat encounter design. Because that's what, especially in the worlds of D&D, Pathfinder, Starfinder, any Powered by the Apocalypse game, and anything that rolls dice, really, combat is a big part of it. It's a big part of it. And so let's start with the lowest hanging fruit, and then we'll get to those higher fruits later, those tall, uppity fruits sitting in their ivory towers.
Fucking uppity fruits.
Fucking uppity ass fruits. So, combat encounters.
Since we kind of talked about, obviously we can talk about the things that are right in front of our faces, the resources and risks that you're taking. Really quickly with combat is very straightforward. Obviously, it's the health of your character and the resources you have in combat. In D&D, that's very often very demonstrable. You have an action economy. You have
spells
or abilities that have limited uses. And then, of course, your health is a resource that you're actually spending in to make your way through an encounter as well. That's surface level. Very surface level, very this is just literally the nuts and bolts. But what makes a good combat encounter is when to me is when you start adding more. You take that idea of risks and resources that you're spending and you grow those things to be something more. To me, some of the most interesting combat encounters for me have always been when the win-loss scenario has nothing to do with the health of my character.
Usually a time limit or a goal that must be accomplished in a certain number of rounds, or so this could deal with health certainly, but escape, get to a position.
A good old what's the word I'm looking for here? Waves. Combat waves, making your way through multiple rounds of combat, so that you can kind of tap back into that time thing.
Making your way downtown, walking fast.
And I'm homebound. That's right. Another thing that's a risk and a resource in itself is taking a beloved NPC, such as, I don't know, a tabaxi cat named Meatball, and putting him in a very dangerous combat scenario involving a potential eldritch horror in the middle of the Underdark. Who knows? Yep. Just a hypothetical.
Yeah, and so that immediately implies it's all right, so not only do we have to defeat this thing, but while defeating this thing, we must protect this other thing that is not as durable as us. Therefore, we need to constantly make the choice of do we play defense for the protection? Do we go maximum offense and leave the protection or lead the protected NPC a bit more exposed or a bit more at risk? Which, as a GM, gives you unlimited license to absolutely screw the party, because you can just have the thing that needs protection be very bad at defending itself and protecting itself and put itself at great harm's risk.
And let's talk about then what makes a good risk. I think once we're kind of boiling down into that, and this obviously taps into a bunch of other things, and that's why I think life and death is not necessarily always the best risk, because of when you have other things on the line, such as a beloved NPC. yeah, that's life and death, but it's not the death of your characters. It's something a little more out of their control.
Yeah, right? I think what makes a great risk, number one, and the overarching umbrella is emotional investment, right? That's classic storytelling, right? If you're invested in the success and the optimal outcome as players, as the GM, in something, you're going to have more of a good risk. But like talking about mortality, this is a great example. So early in a campaign, let's say you're playing a for simplicity's sake, you're playing a 10 session campaign. The mortality in session 1 is less exciting than the mortality in session 7. Because in session 1, you've not had a lot of time to invest in your characters. Your players haven't had a lot of time to spend with each other as those characters. They don't probably know what the main plot is, or they haven't probably overcome a lot to get there. And so in session 1 and 2, at the very beginning, in the first act, if you will, less exciting, right? If their character dies, oh well, roll up a new character. Or bring in someone new. Here's my twin brother. He's exactly like me. Or he's exactly like the character that just died, right? That kind of thing. But in session 7 of 10, as you're in the beginning of Act 3, now that has a higher risk, because you could, at that table, be like, I don't know if I can replace you for 2 more sessions with a thing. I'll figure out something else for you to do as a player so that you can have fun at the table with the rest of the group. But I can't have you be, I'm not going to introduce a new player in Act 3 or in a character in Act 3 if I don't have to. That's not satisfying for the player or the story or makes sense for the party that much. And so that the immediate emotional attachment is distanced. Because you're only going to see that character for another couple sessions. They're not going to have the history with the party.
I will say this, and this kind of risk discussion kind of encapsulates why I actually think my favorite levels of D&D and Pathfinder are lower levels of play.
Oh yeah,
because as you get higher, all risks are diminished.
Oh, definitely.
And even and to the point where death and injury also become almost meaningless. Once you, especially, we're at the level of play now where Chevy can just fucking resurrect someone from the dead with just a piece of their flesh.
Exactly. And so the risks of death and mortality are almost non-existent.
Yeah. And that's why, I'm always kind of an advocate for lower levels of play. And, I also really like things like injury tables.
Yep. Because those can always apply.
I like injury tables and combat. But let's talk about other things that can be risked. Let's talk about creative ideas about, what can happen in a combat that might not be you getting hurt or someone else getting hurt. You could be having someone steal from you.
Mm-hmm.
You could have something that you need, like a precious object being taken away. Or you could be, there's always the MacGuffin of the story, right? There's always a magical object of unique power that can do things that no other magical object can do, that is key to the story. Now, it's also always important to remember that, failure in these scenarios should never just be, well, you failed and that's it. Because that's also not interesting.
No, failure creates a new challenge path. Failure creates, if something gets stolen from you, you got to go get it back. That's the obvious, right? Right out the gate, you're like, all right, how are we going to get that item back? Okay, that's why a GM should never be like, they take the item and then disappear and there's no trace of them and no way to find them, right? Like you could start it with, there's no trace, you don't see where they went, or they seem to have disappeared, and then inevitably players are going to be like, what can I do to try and find out where they went? Because that's the logical choice. That's the inevitable solve. Players don't want their shit taken, so if you take their shit, they're going to try and get it back. You've created a whole plot.
That's just, and you know what we call that? We call that a hook right there.
Yeah.
If you ever wonder how to get your character, how to get a hook for your characters, take their shit and leave a trail of breadcrumbs.
Another risk. Being found out is a risk. There are whole games built around this. Our former player on Through the Mill, our buddy Greg, has a whole RPG that he made back in the aughts, where the magical warriors that you play are supposed to keep their entire existence on the material plane quiet and hidden. And there are punishments and problems that happen if people see them cast magic in public. And that creates a whole level of tension on how to resolve problems, because you can't just be like, all right, well then I just fucking throw some lightning at this bitch. Because if you're seen with that, not only is there like what the GM could do, the book itself guides like potential problems that come of being caught doing this stuff and everything like that are existent within the world as part of its rule set.
Love this line of conversation about being found out, because of being found out is how you stop one of the most well-discussed problems in tabletop RPGs, murder hobos.
Yep. Repercussions for actions.
Murder hobos? Consequences.
Shit
happens. Oh no, is it not the consequences of my own actions? It is. It is the consequences of your own actions. You go off killing a bunch of people, and someone's going to notice eventually.
Yeah. Other things. Your players likely give you some sense of backstory or plot that is around their character motivation. Putting any of that in threat is a great risk play. And especially if you create divergent paths of desire, right? So like they need to get the MacGuffin, right? They need to get the MacGuffin, but they can't be found out because they did a good job, but the MacGuffin was stolen, and the local the local authority doesn't want any of this shit happening. And so if they get found out on hunting the MacGuffin, then the local authorities might come in. And if your players have familial connections in the same realm as said local authorities, then it's not only their problem, it becomes their family's problem. Because if they can't find you, well, maybe they can find your parents, your significant other and children at home and stuff. And not do anything too dark, but create problems and challenges. So you might then keep dangling that MacGuffin in public zones that would put the security of their loved ones at risk in a kind of esoteric way, but they can get out because they're strong enough to get away from the local guards. But like their brother who owns a bakery in that same town is not. They have a whole fucking day-to-day life, and they need to not have problems with the local authorities and everything. So like constantly playing with not only your characters' backstories, but everything, and having risk of reveal or risk of true understanding of how vigilante a lot of heroing and adventure parties are, is a really great system to put into place in certain regions of your world. I wouldn't always do it unless your whole system of roleplay is built around it, but if you do it sometimes, it challenges the murder hobo problem really, really well, because there's all kinds of consequences that are either direct or indirect that your players are going to be like, well, my character would not put their child at risk in this scenario. Even if they're not like directly there. It's not like the kid is kidnapped. It's like they know my name. They can find out where I live. They can find my daughter. I need to not have that happen. And then that creates a whole scenario of possible branching of it's like, do we need to go back to the house and defend it and look for people scoping it out to become a problem, or do we go to where this lead leads us to get the MacGuffin so we can subvert the evil, bad, corrupt politician that's the mayor of the town, right? There's so many branches you can do just by dangling a MacGuffin at a distance for a little bit and giving your players ultimate consequences to whatever action they choose.
So here's another one I was just thinking of. Oftentimes, a lot of times we encounter, I think chases are actually pretty common.
Yeah.
In a lot of D&D.
You love a good chase, yeah.
A good chase. Now, I think one of the biggest pitfalls of chases is that either chases are too easy and people often catch their prey, or you don't catch the prey and then that leads to a dead end.
Yeah.
And I think that's I think that one is actually probably the worst of the two. Obviously, you want something to be really challenging, but but if you're in a pursuit of an opponent, of an enemy, I think it's always important to make sure that when something ends in failure, that it doesn't end in a dead end in failure. So let's say you're pursuing someone, right? Mm-hmm. Your characters are chasing these bad guys, and they get away. Instead of just having them disappear, you immediately have like an NPC approach them and be like, I saw them. They went that way. I saw the guys you were chasing. Mm. They went that way. Or maybe they were like, oh, I might have seen where they went. Maybe you want to pay me a little bit.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you where they went. But also the other consequence of them getting away is they get back to their hideout and they're prepared for you now. And suddenly what could have been you just dealing with one or two guys who you wanted to interrogate now has transformed into a new combat encounter with a bunch of well-prepared thugs.
Yep, and that's a whole other... You could easily have a situation where you're chasing someone, they get some distance on you, it looks like they're going to get away, and then you can see them couple 100 feet in the distance dip down into the sewers, and now you don't know what path they went in the sewers, and you have this whole sewer thing that you've got to do, which is going to be more methodical because you can make the sewers their hideout, or you can make the sewers dangerous. I like, and I don't think I've done this yet, but I like, because I've seen it more recently within the last year or so, I like a chase where it's not so much that it's challenging to catch the people, because again, a lot of characters, especially in crunchier games, have like lots of abilities and stuff like that can help them catch people. It's that every round a complication of what running someone down in a city or in a forest comes up, and you have to get past that complication to not lose distance on the character. Or on the chase target, and it's not really about the chase. The chase is if you were just in a flat foot run on an empty street, it would take seconds and you would catch up with this person. It's that problem after problem keeps happening, and you can use like random tables for that. You can script that. You can create a table and then have it be on a dice roll, or you can just be like, I'm going to have progressively different challenges, and if they can make it to round 5 and they're smart, they can catch the person there, and if they manage to make it all the way to round 8, they're gonna catch the person. If they fail on the journey to any of this at any of these challenges, then they're just going to fail, or then they're just going to miss them. But you give them that lead of where's the next place to go since you lost the target. Did they get into their fortress? Did they run into a government building and your party of extra legal vigilante superheroes is not really sure that that's going to be okay to just bust into?
Now, to kind of on the flip side of that, when we talk about, you're chasing that bandit, they're trying to run to their hideout to get to their friends. So you have if you have the failure of that, and then they get to their hideout, and then they have a bunch of bandits waiting for you. And on the flip side of that, you catch them, they're going to be able to like lead you to the hideout and give you an advantage of sneaking up on these unsuspecting people at the hideout.
Yeah, that's a win.
So it's like it's really important to make sure to balance those things, and always have a path forward. Because I know as a DM, I have made the mistake of just being like, yeah, you don't find anything.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that maybe that after a failure, once again, one of the things I've come back to many times is that you shouldn't necessarily have dice rolls for something if the outcome of a failure is that nothing happens and nothing moves forward.
Yep. No, that's you are correct. It is what's the term? I think a good GM advice for a failure is and this is weird advice to come from me, but God closes a door and opens a window. It is like the failure is a guide to the next challenge, not a full stop. Otherwise, if it's just not going to work, or if whatever they're thinking or trying to do isn't going to work, you can kind of quickly narrate or simply state like a statement of that. But even then, you usually want to give someone, it's like, hey, I try to do this. Maybe I do like in a D&D sense, like a locate creature, and it's within X many thousand of feet and everything. And it's like simply telling someone that burned a spell that, sorry, the creature's not anywhere in the area. You can do that. Dungeons are a great place to do that, where it's like you're going to be burning resources. That's a whole different challenge category, encounter category we're going to talk about. But if you're in like a chase scene or an investigate scene, and someone's like locate creature, and up to 1,000 feet, by going, they're not within 1,000 feet of you. You don't have a direction on the creature. That gives you an idea that it's been at least 15 minutes since they were here, or they used magic to get away. And then maybe someone can be like, oh, can I do a detect magic, see if I can figure out a spell? You're giving them options of like what they can do next to continue progressing the plot, not just making them struggle to come up with ideas with flat no's that are neither narratively satisfying or particularly feel like raise party morale. Like if everything always moves the needle, which is how life works, if everything always moves the needle in one direction or the other, then it feels like movement and progression or regression and greater risk, which is also good. If something's just neutral, that's not fun.
And I think one of the things you were kind of getting at, now we're kind of moving a little bit out of combat and more into exploration spaces. Yep. And oftentimes exploration spaces in the frames of like time frames too. And this is something that 4th edition implemented, and then it came out, and then people have pretty much adopted in 5th edition, was skill challenges. In which you had like a series of, here, I'll give you a high five. There we go.
Bring that camera focus back.
The smoke messes with it. So like skill challenges, I think this is kind of getting into a territory where like combat and exploration blur a little bit, you know, where you're having that time sensitive stuff. And you're talking about failure. And oftentimes I actually kind of don't like the way that skill challenges are set up, because they're like, oh, you need to get half of the skill challenge is successful or more to succeed at the skill challenge. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't necessarily think that you need to have it be so rigid. I think you could have it be, okay, I'm going to have a series of 15 skill challenges that are really fucking hard, and they may be built so that they maybe only mathematically are likely to succeed at like 3 or 4 of them.
Yeah.
And so to give an example of what that might look like, the opening of Indiana Jones is mostly failure.
Yeah.
Like him going in, he obviously catches one of the successful. He makes a skill check catching a puzzle at the begin, or a trap at the beginning, but that doesn't identify the trap of where the idol is. He fails an athletics jump when he has to jump to get across a gap to catch the guy who now has the idol, and that means that so he doesn't get to immediately pursue that guy. He has to grab and pull himself up. Mm-hmm. Like he barely makes it out of there, and probably if you were to like do it on like a really good scale, probably only maybe succeeded at about one of the 5 different challenges that was in front of him, which allowed him to not get crushed by the boulder.
Yep, that's
really
about it. Yeah, and skin of his teeth, which is the ultimate goal for all tension in any kind of like mortality threatening or damage threatening or goal threatening thing. Is skin of your teeth is, you know, you want a heist plan and then you want that heist plan to go sideways and you want it to barely just work. You want a deceit play, like a confidence man play, and you want that to you want people to actively be suspicious in the mix, so you're not constantly automatically succeeding at everything. And so yeah, putting that, I agree with you. I think skill challenges, I am a big fan of the skill challenge, the thinking person skill challenge, which is the everybody does things and everybody can do these things, but you can all only use one unique aspect of your character. This works really well in D&D and Pathfinder because you have a bunch of different like skills that you can roll on, being like, how do you use that ability to overcome, to contribute your part of overcoming it, and then at the end of that, of everybody contributing what they're doing, you set the difficulty of it based off the cleverness of your players. And I think that's a really fun way to reward players for outside of the box thinking and things like that. Or if you have a table that loves to optimize and is like, all right, who's the best at this thing? You should just keep doing that thing because you have a big bonus to it and you're most likely to succeed at it. And in all, you know, you might shorten up the challenge at that point, but you're still rewarding them for being like, okay, you strategized well to overcome this problem. Good job. That's what you were supposed to do. That's the goal. And if sometimes it's easy, but sometimes easy is fine. That you don't want it always to be easy, but it's perfectly fine to, you know, allow an encounter session, whether it's combat or otherwise, to be sometimes you just fucking you kick down the door, walk up, take the MacGuffin you need, fucking swirly one of your opponents, and then you don't even finish the fight. You just walk away. They can't do anything because you're just rolling too good. And the situation, you did a smart thing at the beginning, and it totally fouled up the plans of the NPCs you were dealing with, also known as your GM's plans for creating this thing. It's okay to have that happen sometimes. That's perfectly fine. No player dislikes the occasional absolute dunking on their GM. We all love it.
Oh yeah, I mean it's definitely important to have those moments too. I do, and I think I've mentioned this before, but now we're moving more towards the exploration.
Yeah, the exploration
encounter. Yeah, I think exploration has never taken more of a backseat than it has in modern play of 5th edition.
Yeah, I think it does.
And I think that has happened immensely to the detriment of play.
Yeah.
And what happens is that you know, I see so many DMs. And this is, once again, we're going to talk more specifically about D20 systems, Pathfinder, D&D.
This could also apply to Powered by the Apocalypse too. Anything that you roll on.
That players get to their encounters, to their fights, and they just bulldoze the enemy. And you'll hear people say that what D&D is built on, a 5 encounter a day economy.
Like
and DMs think, oh, that's crazy. I'm not going to have 5 fights in a day. No, the key word here is not 5 fights. It's 5 encounters.
Yeah, give them 5 challenging things to overcome.
And each one of those, and your encounters should be built to drain your party of resources.
Yeah,
I want to point out the most recent little dungeon crawl we've been doing, I have been having so much fun in that, for one. And I love that we have been able to get through that largely without being in combat. But we have been spending resources.
Yeah.
Every step of the way, we've been having to do something. Sometimes we got away with it a little bit more clever thinking and some lucky dice rolls. But sometimes we had to freaking roll out some spells or something.
Usually that's paired. The clever thinking is, oh, I have this spell or ability I can burn to make this an easier challenge. And it's like I love that.
Dropping invisibility on everyone.
Yeah, invisibility, fly, those kinds of things. Those are the kinds of things that allow you to cleverly overcome challenges. And so, let's talk about exploration encounters, because exploration encounters are kind of it can be a broader umbrella, because they're most applicable to dangerous places. 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a dungeon, or like a haunted castle, or like a creepy wood or bog or marsh.
Where monsters live.
A place where monsters live, but also where just dangerous shit exists, right? Which is pretty much all of current Through the Mill. Is everything is bad. This whole area is bad. Trust nothing. If you see things, they're probably cursed. You can take them; they'll have value, but they're probably cursed, and that might be a problem down the road. But nonetheless, when you're doing an exploration encounter, the exploration is about two big things. Path, you've got to have path options. And the second thing is you've got to obfuscate ahead of time whatever's coming down the path, whatever's coming up on that path. And so the reason that these are important is because you quickly define that your players have multiple paths they could go. You as the GM have all of these different ideas on what could be in those paths. And if you've set that up correctly, while your players are going down that path, or those paths, you can have them be challenged on trying to figure out what's the most optimal path, trying to figure out what the safest path is, going down a path, realizing it's threatening, and maybe doubling back a little bit, making different choices on what they want to do. And then if you're, as a GM like me, where you oftentimes tend to have what I like to call movable set pieces, you can balance the experience by being like, okay, so I haven't given them, and like they went down this path, and by happenstance they ran into something they had to fight, and so they fought that thing. It lasted 2 rounds, and then they moved forward down the path a little bit more. I could preset in those paths a whole bunch of things, and they could happen into fight after fight after fight. That's not satisfying. So I tend to be like, all right, let me move something around. If you want to do this without pre-planning, you simply have a table of shit that they could run into, and you just set the rule. You're going to roll on the table. If you roll the same thing twice, you re-roll again to avoid doing the same thing twice, and then that way you're still keeping it kind of random. If you're me, you're always trying to predict what the players are likely to do and set up what you want to focus on their most likely path, but so you're not having to do a lot, but you're constantly putting up different kinds of challenges in the exploration challenge, which inherently is its own problem of figuring out where to go.
I want to talk about some other good risks and stuff that can happen in this kind of exploration space. So I think it's a thought exercise. What could be the many outcomes of a failure to succeed at jumping across a pit?
Mm-hmm.
There's so many ways as a DM that you can be like, oh, there's this pit, there's this opening, this gap that they can jump across.
Mm-hmm.
And the only one that you shouldn't ever do is you fall and you die.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not interesting. That's just bad. You fall and you die. So let's, obviously success is you jump across the gap. Great. Things you can happen when you fail to cross, and I know this is just a very narrow focus thing, but I want to try and kind of use this as an idea to inspire people's creativity about how failure can be actually dynamic. The first one that can be is that they jump across, but they don't quite make it, and they hit hard on the other side and take like a D8 of damage. Suddenly they're having to spend that HP resource, or they fall on the other side, teeter back, and then something falls off of their belt, and they've lost a crucial item to whatever they're gonna do. They've lost a piece. They've lost their rope or whatever. Now, another interesting one, and one that's more risky from a DM's perspective, not from a player's perspective. Obviously, it's risky for a player too. But is if they fail that check and then they fall down that hole, that should lead them not to death, but to a new space and a new concern of a party divided.
Yep.
So that's a real thing to do as well, is make that pit somewhere lead somewhere. Another good one, let's say they jump, they clear the gap, but they roll their ankle on the other side. That's a failure on there. And then suddenly, oh man, you are taking your movement speed's halved for the next 10 minutes.
You're slowed down a bit more. You're slowing the rest of the party down.
And you have disadvantage on stealth checks and acrobatic checks for the next hour. Like stuff like that. So suddenly you're putting stuff in front of them. Well, that will then also carry over into that combat encounter of having to spend that health resource, suddenly having hindered movement, or suddenly somehow having some other cost that's going to make the next thing they encounter more difficult.
I mean, it's easy. It's as easy as doing something like, okay, everyone's trying to help each other get over this pit, and it's like, all right, maybe one of your party members not that athletic, probably not going to clear it. You can help them, but in order to help them, then the more athletic person and the party member have to roll something, and they could get another person in mild trouble, or make it more challenging, or somebody catches them before they fall down into the pit, but when catching them they dislocate their shoulder, and more things. Or they go down a pit. If you want to be real simple, they fall down a pit. They fall down, they take some damage on the fall, but it's not mortal or anything like that. They take some damage on the fall, and now you got to get them out of the pit. And at the very least, you're burning resources to get them out of the pit.
And that's why I'll toggle back to this one thing that we probably visited many times before. And one of the things that we'll take from Garrett Gygax is that tracking time is important because of time is a resource.
Yeah.
And time should time is a thing that is spent, and that's why, like, oh, you're gonna have to spend 10 minutes pulling your friend out of this pit. That's a roll on the random encounter table.
Yeah, I'm gonna give you an example that happened, and I think I mentioned it to you after session. That happened at our last session, where there was a big old monster at the end of there's a big old monster that you came upon at the end of the like 3 map phase of this area you're in. And that big old monster is there, and you're going to fight the big old monster. But if you had been real fighty in the first map and taken time there, which I built the encounter to suck up a lot of time, if you'd made that choice, that amount of noise would have acknowledged that the monster was going to approach you. And depending on how much time you took, or how much delay you took, it was potentially that monster in the second phase, in the second map, or potentially that monster in the first map. And would that have meant that I would have built maps and stuff that you probably would have never encountered because that happened? Sure, but it meant that your player choices actually defined how challenging and in threat you were without you knowing. And then afterward, always feel free as the DM to be like, you made good choices, and here's why. This could have gone really bad, but you were all very clever and good, and you wanted to hustle to the goal that already had a time limit. Time is so important of being like, yeah, in like an hour or so, if you don't deal with this, it's a problem, right? Like,
it could also be something very immediately, though. It could be like, you have 1 round of movement for everyone to get into a hiding spot.
Yeah.
And you're in a big open space. Does everyone even have the space to get somewhere to hide?
Yeah. And yeah, time is a great risk.
Maybe one of those people rolled their ankle, failing a jump across a pit earlier, and now they're at half movement speed and disadvantage on that stealth check. And suddenly that monster comes into the room, and everyone else managed to find a hiding spot, but not the wizard with the hurt ankle.
Nope. And yeah, so exploration, and especially exploration in dangerous spaces specifically, where threats are about, is satisfying because there's the risk factor of threats, especially if those threats aren't inherent to the reason that you are in the space. That is always amazing because it makes the party feel like it's like, I wasn't even supposed to be here today. I need to get through this, and you're in my way just to get to the thing that I want to get to, which creates a sense of urgency. And then those threats are wearing down, that you can present those threats in obvious traps, which, like you said, you've got to jump over a pit. It's a pretty far pit. You're like it's far enough where most of the party can't just run and jump it. So how do you address that problem? That's an encounter, right? That's in and of itself the lightest form of a puzzle. Is all right, here's something that you can't obviously just step through. It's an old video from Ego Raptor called sequel from his Sequel Island series that he only did a few of before people got, where it's like talking about puzzles in Zelda where you just look around for the place to shoot it, and then that opens the door, and it's like, is that a puzzle? And it's not a puzzle because there's no challenge of coming up with a way that you're going to solve it because you know how to solve it. That's the same as literally turning a doorknob or pressing a button.
It is technically an encounter.
It's an encounter.
In that you are spending a resource to get past an obstacle. Yeah.
But it's not really a challenge or a puzzle. But you could make it one, being like, all right, taking it up to 11, right? All right, so there's these glowy orbs that are right beside every door, and it has a magical word that you have to say and put your palm on it to open the door. You can still open the door on it, but if you put your palm on it, not that I'm a big fan of this mechanic in D&D, but if you put your palm on it and you don't say the magical word, you can still get the door open, but you take a level of exhaustion. It drains some of your energy, and the magic word is just to prevent it from draining some of your energy. And then you put enough doors in front of them, and now you're back at the other layer of the puzzle, which is, how do I do this without burning myself out on it? I need to, do we all spread it out? Are there 5 party members and 5 doors and everyone takes a level of exhaustion? Is there one party member or a couple party members that can take 2 levels of exhaustion and take the hit for it? Should we be investigating the rooms to see if we can see if someone left a sticky note with a password somewhere carved into this place? When we were asking questions about this castle that's haunted, that has all these orb doors in it and everything, when we were asking questions in the town, did anyone have like a leading statement that I could, even if I don't fully remember it as a player, roll a history or an insight or an investigate check on that thought, being like, is there anything that you said to us as an NPC DM that like should be more like, let us be more aware of it, but we're players, not these actual human beings, so it's not as prescient knowledge to us and everything like that. There's all these conversations that happen there that like can become a thing that is, it's obvious. You touch the orb, the door opens, but you can touch the orb the good way or the bad way, and you may only be able to touch it the bad way. But you can get there and then still have the complication. There's so much with exploration that comes that isn't just fight guys.
A cool idea for a fun, like a fun way of like, really fucking with your players by making them sad. Like, it makes me think of Taz's probably one of their actually least well-loved arcs and how you could take that idea and improve upon it was the Wonderland arc.
Yeah.
And how because of that one was just like a constant just when you fail, you get hurt. Like you don't even get failed. You're just going through this place and getting hurt. And instead, I was just thinking about something like making your characters temporarily give up something really valuable.
Yeah. Classic one is a memory. That's always a good classic go-to because you can tie it into the character story.
I would even do something like, for your next encounter, you don't get bonus actions.
Mm-hmm. Oof.
You can do something like, for your next encounter, you either don't get bonus actions or you don't get reactions.
Do some Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced and have a field or like a situation or a scenario where they have to give up something. The reason I mentioned Tactics Advanced is because they'd have judges that would be like, you can't use swords. And then that would just be the thing, right?
Exactly. Like those kind of like modifiers on the environment. Suddenly, you have to solve all these puzzles. Maybe solving all these puzzles in the dungeon means that you can go into the fight using all of your tools available to you.
Oh.
And if you go into the dungeon without go into the fight without solving all those puzzles, suddenly you don't get. Maybe you're a fighter. You lose one of your extra. You lose your extra attack.
Yeah.
Or you're a spellcaster, and suddenly you can't use 4th level spells.
When designing this encounter, you build it where it's like, okay, I've got 4 party members and I've got 4 puzzles, and solving each puzzle affects each party member. Affects each or saves each party member from a detriment in the end fight with the Ghost King, and so the Ghost King wants you to come in as weak as possible, and if they solve even half the puzzles, then half the party is full fighting force, and the other half is a little bit weakened. But if they solve none of them, they're in a real bad fucking way.
The other approach is that you can sacrifice something, but then also maybe make the enemy sacrifice something in return.
Yeah. I want to do a boss fight where the enemy sacrifices shit to gain an advantage in the boss fight,
or to strip powers away from your characters too. So that's an interesting way of going about it. But give the players the choice of like, if they're going to be doing that, they know they get to choose what they're sacrificing.
Exactly. Your players will choose relevant shit. They want the challenge. They want the challenge.
They want things to be interesting. They want things that shake things up.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting way of going about it. And also let's say you guys, it could also just be like now I keep on going back to Indiana Jones because Indiana Jones has such great adventure stuff that is indicative of it. Now, like for another one, an example of Indiana succeeding at every fucking skill check is at the end of the what is it called, the Crusade?
Last Crusade.
Last Crusade is him going through the trials to get the Holy Grail. Literally succeeds at every single step.
Which, in a narrative device, is very satisfying because it was in theory the final form of Indiana Jones. The best Indiana Jones is supposed to be there, the most capable one. So it's funny that in the first like scene in the first film, even though it's the second movie is a prequel, in the first film you're seeing Indiana Jones struggling to succeed at anything effectively, and in the last movie, in the last scene of the movie, even though there's a couple specific like momentary troubles, overall he's extremely effective, and it's like, yeah, this is what happens when you've been doing this shit over and over again.
Even despite him being extremely effective, they still end up in the custody of the Nazis in the temple in the last scene of the movie with his father dying. Like, even being really good at everything,
they're still
doesn't
lost.
Get you. You still don't get everything, and that's also another thing that makes sure like that's important to get to. But let's kind of like steer back towards exploration, and let's start going towards the less lethal end of exploration and what that can mean, and things like investigation or research, trying to understand the environment around you. Makes me think about something earlier on in our campaign when we were in the city of, I think it was Furhat?
Yeah, the Free City.
Was it the Free City?
Yeah.
And we were going to the casino, which had an extensive library, or we were going to this library, which had an extensive collection. And looking back on that one sparked some ideas in me about, like, how would I handle this scenario? And and I don't want you to take this as me being a critique on that scenario, because if it was like, but it was like, it was kind of sparking creativity in me. Like, that's an interesting thing. Like, what would be the consequences of your players looking for information and failing at a roll? Well, and one of the things you did was it takes you to more time to find it.
Yeah.
And that's a good example of just like giving yourself as a DM options.
Yeah.
Because let's say you don't have necessarily something planned, but you're like, well, shit, I don't like failing at this roll needs to be meaningful. Right? Failing at this roll should be meaningful. Every time a roll fails should be meaningful. What does that mean? It should never mean you don't just, you don't find anything, dead end. Blah, blah, blah. That's the end. That's fucking lame. We'll say that 1,000 times. So it kind of ties back to that, like giving yourself time to let other things happen.
And now using time as a resource. Of it being like, now you got to be stuck in the city.
Now we're stuck here, and we have to deal with the shit that's happening while we wait for this information to come to us.
It is so necessary in my mind to always be so, like, a lot of exploration. You were talking about investigation. You were talking about insight and like learning about the environment. It is a common conversation to not bury your lore behind like dice rolls and skill checks, because then if they fail, you can't give it to them, right? And no, you can. You just have to give them some other negative for failing and everything, and then either give it to them later very deliberately, the reason the library is such a great example is just like, listen, this character knows how to read books and will take the time to learn what they need to learn and make the choice to stick around and keep at it, right? A classic conundrum of it's just like, well, I just keep trying until I succeed, right? And so what you do then is you don't necessarily bury the lore behind the skill check. You bury when the lore gets revealed behind the skill check. Does it get revealed at earliest and most advantageous point, or does it get revealed afterward? Does it come from the book research, or does it come from some random NPC that they couldn't have possibly encountered until after the research would have been more beneficial? And then even then you can then be like, okay, well, they didn't get it here, and so they're gonna get the kind of fill in of like all the context of like what was going on, and more importantly, I can seed in another fucking hook for like the next step, because now that I wouldn't have necessarily done, because I'm giving them because they failed, but I still want to give them the reward for continuing to engage.
I just had one really fun idea that would be applicable in this particular scenario, and I find that players going to libraries and places of knowledge is a pretty common. It's a common thing that happens.
Yeah.
You get to that library, you roll that research, your research or your investigation or whatever the hell you're doing, and you fail. What does that mean? Oh, that one book you're looking for? It's checked out and overdue. And now you have to track down that dude and get the book back from the library, and suddenly you're on a little quest.
The book is a MacGuffin, and you got to go get the little MacGuffin thing. Like, yeah, there's a quest, right? Or you set it up where it's almost like a skill challenge, where if they succeed, you're like, okay, you're going to learn a little bit about this. I'm going to give you a piece of this. Then I'm going to go back to what another player is doing. Then I'm going to come back to you. You're going to try again. You're going to learn a little bit more. I'm going to go back to what other, and if you fail enough times, something then happens in that library that you wouldn't have seen if you had succeeded, that is also a problem, right? Like oh no, now the crime lord of the town walks in and they know every mover and shaker in the town, and you're loaded up with weapons because you're a wandering adventurer, and they're gonna fucking clock that shit. They're gonna be like, I don't know this this stranger with all these weapons that looks incredibly dangerous that's sitting there reading a stack of books. What's up with that? And or maybe you're like, you ask the librarian about stuff. They point you to the to the section you need to research. They secretly reach out to someone that is their sibling that's involved in some organization that is a blockade for your success, and now there's a secret time limit going on in the background that is happening, and the character doesn't know, the player doesn't know, but you know, and then you're like, okay, so have
you ever heard of tension dice?
Yes, I have heard of tension dice.
If you haven't heard of it out there, people who will eventually someday watch this thing, go look up tension dice. I think it's the Angry GM.
Yeah.
The Angry GM's tension dice. Great mechanic. Really great at keeping things interesting when failure occurs. And keeping things just interesting, moving.
Yeah, it's part of why that whole, system of partial success with complications and everything. It's part of systems like that we're trying to mechanize just good design for challenges, which is just like get the GM and the players in the headspace that a success isn't necessarily a complete success every time, and a failure is almost never a complete and abject failure. That a lot of times it's an in-between, and that's more interesting to talk about and play in. And I think it's partially the fault of video games, because video games are very much about success or failure by the nature of what they are. About
you succeed your way through video games.
Yeah, that's the point. Is you're supposed to succeed your way.
In video games, you succeed your way through a video game. And the only time when your character doesn't succeed is typically during cutscenes, in which they take your power away and make bad shit happen.
Exactly, because they don't want to rob you of your agency, of your skill level at playing the game. Totally understandable, but it creates, taking that into tabletop campaign, what you get then is, in the tabletop campaign, you're letting them fail forward, not like generally, like, again, there's campaigns and systems, right, that are like built for like you die and you lose, right? And like in a conversation with your players before you get started, that's absolutely a valid TTRPG system to engage in. But like for the majority of play, the journey is the GM has a story that they want to reveal to the players and have the players engage in and contribute to, and the players want to unravel the story and affect the world. That's why everyone's sitting and playing that campaign, or that session together. So generally for TTRPGs, you want the ability to roll forward in some fashion, so that whether it's through succeeding forward or failing forward, you're getting a forward momentum. And there's some video games that do that. Very like a lot of indie games that are very story based do this all the time. I played one called Beacon Hill, where it's literally like, oh, you went down it's a choose your own adventure essentially, and it's like, you went down this path. That wasn't good, but they actually bury the option to succeed in the long term by going through the failure path. So mechanically the game just rolls you back, and then you have the option to do something you didn't have the original time, not on the same thread but on a different thread, and you're kind of figuring out how the story and how all the different ways this wouldn't have worked out is. And that's like the point of the game, is to reveal the many branches that don't work out and the one path that does. And the game makers want you to see as much of it as they can, so they really build it around that. But like that kind of is more how TTRPG should be, without the fact that in the game you just die and then the narrator's like, that's not how it should have happened, and you roll back to a specific point or a different point on a different branch, but now you have a different kind of reaction and choice that you got on the failing branch. You wouldn't have ever got it without the failing branch and stuff. So it's more of a non-linear reveal kind of thing. But like, that's the kind of mentality you should be looking at in your TTRPG encounter delivery. And it is especially useful in exploration, where you can have the whole path not traveled and you never see what happens there. But and that's going to be part of it. But you could also have, you fail to go figure out the puzzle that's the obvious doorway of the room, and your failure rumbles and shakes the ground and opens up a pit beneath everybody, and you fall 2 floors, and now you got to figure out this area and how to get back. And that led to a back route that got you to where you were originally going to go. You could have been successful at solving the puzzle. You didn't solve the puzzle. That's fine. You still get to your target. Now you just went this different way that you did not have to necessarily go down. All of this matters in encounters because, like you said, there is nothing worse than combat. That's what combat is for. Combat and its many, many attempts and rounds is for, I try to do the thing, you don't successfully do the thing, all right, I'll try again next round. Because it's mechanically built to do that. Mm-hmm. The broader sense of encounters, the end result of combat, the end result, the process of exploration, the process of puzzle challenges, all of that should much more be like, well, I failed, and it got really interesting because of that. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, I still got to the goal.
I do want to touch base on combat a little bit more for just a moment. Now that you mentioned that, because of we talked briefly about how the better, in many ways, a good combat encounter is not show up and kill the creature. It's have another objective happening in the environment whilst engaged in combat with monsters you can kill. And the other thing I want to touch base on, though, is that I think that there's this expectation that combat be balanced in D&D and other D20 games. Mm-hmm. And I actually want to caution people against going out of their way to overly balance their encounters. Mm-hmm. And encounters should be swingy. There should be times when your players show up and find a bunch of monsters and, like you said, handedly stomp their asses into the ground.
Yeah.
And then there should be other encounters that they may run into where Gandalf turns and says, "This foe is beyond any of you." And the encounter is not to turn and fight the Balrog, but to get the fuck away from the Balrog. Yeah. And that can still be done in combat. But I think the important thing is that it's okay for you as a DM to just straight up say, this is not a fight you're intended to win. This isn't a fight you're intended to survive.
Yeah.
Make your way, survive this fight.
Yeah, survive.
And so don't be afraid as a DM to tell that to your players, because of they may not know, they may not figure that out. It may not be readily apparent that the monster you put in front of them isn't meant to be killed. It's meant to be, we do everything we can to get away from this.
That's why narratively low levels is a little bit easier, because you can just put something in there, and the way that you describe it, low level party or early narrative party is going to be like, that feels way beyond the scope of our abilities, versus especially the back half of middle and end game of parties, where it's like nothing is beyond us.
And that's kind of ties into where I was saying earlier about how higher levels you just have a way of dealing with the costs of the exploration inside of things, where you're doing an exploration, you fall and hurt your leg, you got someone with lesser restoration, you can just heal your wound, heal your sprained ankle.
Yeah.
There goes that burden. Yeah, they had to spend a spell slot, but
they've got a lot.
at higher levels, you kind of have a bunch of them. I definitely have more than enough spell slots to get myself through multiple encounters and using a spell every single turn.
Yeah.
So, but let's. And I only want to touch base on that briefly, and I'll swing us back towards.
Well, actually, we're moving out of exploration encounters, which can encompass so much. Exploration encounters. We are going to talk about one of the lost arts of encounters, of tabletop RPGs, especially in the crunchy systems, traveling encounters. So, Lord of the Rings is a great trilogy of movies that's mostly walking. Clerks 2 very much clearly expressed this, and it is 100% accurate. It's a lot of walking from point A to point B, and then to point C, and then to point D. And there's a lot of journey in between. And it will be tempting, and I fall into this category too, it's extremely tempting to create set pieces and have those be what your party actually engages in, is the set pieces, right? So on the journey from point A to point B, in between there, you have created 3 set pieces on that journey to give it some feeling of time, but it's still just moving from big encounter to big encounter, or notable prepared fiction.
And one of the things that this is also a big problem for is that you may be unwittingly railroading.
Oh, certainly.
If you do this, but if you're not creating a world where they can go off the, literally go off the rails, then and the only options are the things that you're like, this is what I'm going to put in front of you. Then that is kind of railroading. Now, railroading isn't always bad.
Yeah,
I will say that. Railroading isn't always bad. There's a time and place for it. It depends on how you handle it. Are you doing it with a white glove, or are you doing it with a hammer? Players can be led into railroading and it be rewarding, or they can be pushed into railroading and it can be frustrating.
And the way to get around that and make them feel less pushed into railroading all the time, and let your players know that you're the kind of DM, GM, storyteller that lets them know that if they're, that the choices are theirs, kind of thing, is number one, you can always give path options, even on a grander scale of traveling. You can be like, okay, so you got out of your starter area, and now there's these 3 regions on the map that you could go to. It's your choice. I do not care which one you go to. I will be ready for it wherever you decide to go. All of them have equal levels of importance, and your choice is going to matter because the other areas will be affected by you not going there, or bits of the story will be affected by you not going there first. But you can go there. You can hit all of them if you want to in order, or you go in any order that you want to choose. So you can simplify it for yourself as a GM to do that, so that you don't have to worry about the whole of the world. But on top of that, in my opinion, it's really about that journey. And when you're talking about encounters and where to use tables, man, traveling is table time.
Traveling is the thing.
Is table time.
I think a lot of people are reluctant to use hex crawls.
Yeah.
And I actually think that we should. I mean, I really want to try a hex crawl. I haven't actually had the opportunity to use a hex crawl because the vast majority of my games are. I like to do smaller campaigns, narrow focused. I like to keep people in like a contained area for the most part, and let that be a sandbox they play in. But I do want to get to an adventure where we do a hex crawl. And here's one. I think a lot of DMs put this pressure on themselves to create everything, and this is why you're going into tables. And hex crawls, all you got to really do is put where your players are and put where they're going on the map. And then leave that hex, and then maybe trace the outline of the continent, but leave it blank. Place a few important items there, and then let the players discover the world alongside you.
Yep, that is such a great system for exciting yourself as the DM.
Because you're going to roll that dice and something is going to come up that you have a list for, you have something there for, but you didn't expect it to show up then.
Yeah.
You didn't know it was going to come up then. And now suddenly, because the players only see what you're giving, what you describe to them, maybe what you rolled in this particular instance doesn't make quite sense where it's at. But rather than finding the urge to roll again and come up with new space, redesign that place, reflavor that place and its description to fit there.
But yeah, this is where, when you're designing traveling encounters, what you really want to do is have surprise, because that's what traveling is it's a bunch of surprises. You know where your goal location is, but you don't know what's in between those spaces, right? And so you can do traveling, if you're talking about the old walking horseback methodology of traveling, right? You can do a ton of tables of things that can happen. This is where weather comes into play. This is where random encounters come into play, whether they be combat or social. This is where random rumors of loot come into play, where you can veer off the path to do things. And again, you can use time as your friend here and be like, the thing that you need to get to, you need to get there within a week, which means you can dally a little bit, because it only should take 4 days to get there or 5 days to get there. But if you dally too long, you can create a negative consequence for the party based off of their choice to dally too long. And you don't have to use tables. You can fill it with a bunch of prep stuff that you've done, or build your own tables and be like, I'm fine in whatever order these come up with. I just want it to feel very random and luck of the draw. Both of those things. I want to
say to that, though, about the tables. DMs out there, especially new ones, you don't need to make everything. You don't.
Yeah, tables are there for a reason. There's endless websites that do
so much content out there. There's so much content out there.
Just do that.
Don't be prideful about it. Get out there and use that shit.
You want me to get nasty with the table? You want me to get nasty with the table? Here's how you get nasty with the table. Mm-hmm. So your DM, you're feeling a little bad because you're just like, this is a table. It's a random encounter. I'm not as excited about it because it doesn't feel like it's part of the narrative or tied into the characters. Then tie it into the characters. If you're an improv DM, you can just do this on the spot. But if you're not an improv DM, if you're new at it, if you're worried about it, be like, all right, here's the traveling in the forests table. And it's like, all right, spider attack, right? Bandits, special cave with magical energy coming out of it, bears, all kinds of stuff, picnicking family, a cult troop, small woodland village that's being harassed by a werewolf. All kinds of shit can happen in forests, right? And so you get this list of tables, very generic kind of events that can occur, and then you just do a brief pass through, and you're just like, all right, spiders attack. Why do spiders attack? Well, spiders have been increasing recently. I'm just going to steal from Final Fantasy here. Monsters have been popping up recently for some reason and everything. If they happen to hit that spiders attack table, they're not going to know why spiders or big giant spiders are even along the paths of this. But now they're going to be kind of curious to find out. You can narrate that it's like, you find it a little odd that these spiders are just on this trail, and none of the king's men are clearing them for safe passage.
I'm just going to go off. You probably have an idea of a story. Yeah. My idea of a story is this. Suddenly you're like, oh, well, maybe you find out a piece of information that these giant spiders are normally very subterranean, right?
Yeah.
And then you're like, well, why would these giant spiders be out in the woods when they're subterranean? There's a cave nearby? Why? Yeah. Oh, let's go check out the cave. You find out that the cave has been taken over by, like, a cult and has forced the spiders out of the cave. And suddenly you're now investigating this cult.
Yeah,
that might have been the whole point of your story along, was tracking down this evil dragon worshipping cult, and now you find out there's a consequence of their actions that are not a direct thing that they are doing, but the result of their activities influencing others.
Yeah, and it makes the world feel alive. It makes the random tables play into your hand. And you can kind of go through and do that thing if you like everything to be really tied into the story or tied into the characters. Or you can be in a campaign where you're like, yeah, traveling out in the world is dangerous, and sometimes unrelated dangerous shit happens to your characters, and you got to figure out how to deal with it. And that's why not everyone is just a bunch of adventurers wandering around the world, is because most people don't have magic or well-crafted armor and weapons and combat abilities. Most people aren't masterfully trained in this, so if they run into giant spiders because the cultists happen to move in them and they have no idea what they're doing, they're just going to die. So guess what? They don't go out that direction. It fills the world with a sort of realism that makes your party, even if it's struggling to survive, more effective than the other humanoids they meet, and also makes their risk reward management be more unique than other people, because it's like, well, there's soldiers and everything, but it's like, yeah, but if you're managing payroll and defending your city state, do you waste soldiers to deal with this rumors of spiders? That feels like it just might cost you some bodies that you need to desperately prepare your major trade routes. So you're just not going to deal with that problem. But you as adventurers were just trying to cut through to get to this area faster, and you happened into the problem, right? And like all of that stuff that like is intrinsic to entertaining and almost like are entertaining open world games and things like that can be in your TTRPGs, open world video games, can be in your TTRPGs and can tie in as much or as little to the main plot, because again, everyone's gathered around the table to have fun with challenges, to play these encounters however they come. And some tables love a good random thing, some tables love it all to be deeply tied to the plot. But like at the end of the day, they're still hitting the same mark. I want something cool and surprising that I have to figure out how to deal with and what the cost to benefit ratio is.
And here's the other thing I want to mention about these hex crawl grids and things like that too. One, they're a phenomenal opportunity for you to see lore in your world.
Yep.
And I want to do a whole other episode about lore and seeding lore in your world and what good lore is versus bad lore.
Yep.
But there's a great opportunity for seeding lore into your world, and not every hex crawl grid needs to be populated with something big and groundbreaking.
Nope.
It can be literally just something cool on the side of the road. You do not need to have every little piece of everything filled with something meaningful. And so sometimes it can just be like you find something small that teases about what you may find in the next grid over. Or you could just find a nice little inn, and it's a good place because you do need to have a place to stop, and there doesn't necessarily need to be a story. There could be just some sweet people there that your characters have some fun interactions with and then go on their way. It doesn't always need to be super dense.
No, it doesn't. You don't need it to be, much as I love the series, you don't need every fucking session, every fucking moment of your D&D campaign or your Pathfinder campaign or your Monster of the Week campaign, every single second of it to be like turned up to 11 a la Star Trek Discovery, where everything's so hyper dramatic that nothing has meaning. There's no waning or waxing of intensity.
Stories are supposed to kind of ebb and flow in their intensity, right? And so you can use these kind of travel moments to let your story have moments of calm and brevity in them, where your players can relax.
The other thing is that when you do a hex crawl or when you do kind of like a random table or anything, you also get to be surprised as the GM sometimes, because let's say by happenstance you land into a couple hexes or a couple regions, a couple random encounters, and they were pretty tough and it was pretty exhausting, and it's midday, let's say it's midday or early evening, and you're trying to get to point B. You need to get to point B to accomplish your goal. But then, randomly, you get calm, peaceful inn. I guarantee you, whatever happened previously, as random as it was, if you were rolling on a table, whatever happened previously will inform immediately the predictive next action for the party. And they might be like, I know we got to get there, but this inn is nice and it's safe. I've burnt some spell slots. I've eaten some resources. We got out by the skin of our teeth. Or if anything like that happens again, we don't know what the night's going to look like, right? And everything. And so maybe your party is like, all right, it's 2 p.m., I guess we're staying at the inn for the rest of the day so we can get a long rest. Or we go out by night after we get our long rest, or after we take a moment to do there. Or maybe the hex you were just at is filled with like a bunch of like monsters, and then you get to the sweet little inn hex, and then you as the GM can immediately have the thought, how does this sweet little inn butt up like a quarter of a mile away to Monster Forest? They simply must have something cool going on there.
I highly recommend everyone who's making tables to not use a straight like D10 or D100 or D20 table. Use a 2D6, use a 2D10, use a 2D12, because this will create a bell curve of what you can encounter. Because if you use just a straight one dice roll, you're gonna you're just as likely to encounter the dangerous, deadly dragon hex crawl as you are to encounter the nice, pleasant inn.
Yeah, no, crawl. You can absolutely. That's a good bit of advice. Is when doing table builds, take the one off. Right, if you're using 2 die, take the one off, right, and then be like, okay, it's very it's classic, roll a craps table rules, right? You have the most combination of die to come up, and so put that as your almost nothing happens. Put that as your you travel and it's
you find cool, interesting things to look at, talk about for a little bit, and then move on.
It's you just kind of move along. There's a cool waterfall over there, like that's it. And then
some beautiful old ruins with not a whole lot to find because they've been picked over the centuries.
You can see they're Stonehenges basically. They're just stones on with moss on them and everything. And then make your most threatening counters on the edge in either direction, or most wildly rewarding or wildly threatening counters on the far edges. And then your players are going to know that. They're going to be like, oh, it's super unlikely for me to get. It's a 1 in 100 chance to get a 20 on a 2d10, correct? I want to say 1 in 100.
Well, I mean, so you'll just roll percentile dice. But yeah, if you roll percentile dice, you roll you have your 2d10, and you roll. You're going to actually have one will be a 10 and one will be a 0, or whatever.
No, not rolling percentile dice. So you have to roll a 10 and a subsequent 10 to get whatever is 20 on the table. That takes it from being a 5% chance to a 1% chance.
1%,
yeah, and everything, and then and your players inherently know that. And so they're like, oh, what's a 20? Because they know, and they're going to figure out very quickly, if you use this repeatedly, they're going to figure out very quickly they want to hit those middle numbers. That's where they want to live. And they'll hit them most of the time.
The most common number they're going to roll is 6 on the 2d10. Because there's just so many combinations. Of just like, actually, no, it would not be 6. What would it be? It would be 11? It would be 10. It would be 10 or 11. It would be 11.
Yeah.
And then on if you're rolling 2d6, the most common number you roll is 7.
Yeah, exactly.
There's way more. There's so many different ways to roll 7. So if you roll 2d6, you have 6 and 1, 5 and 2, 4 and 3 are all the ways you can get 7. You have more ways to get 7 on 2d6 than any other number. So you create that good bell curve.
And then that way, that's a great bit of advice. Okay, so I want to, before we go too long, I want to talk about another important encounter. And this is a toughie. There's actually a lot of mechanical things to do with this because it's got an inherent system in like your D20 systems. But this is a toughie. This is probably the hardest group of encounters to crack because of the nature of what people typically play it, myself included, versus what it could be. The social encounter. So the social encounter on its surface is we're talking and investigating or deceiving or just like communicating and gathering information, right? That's 99% of social encounters are about deceiving to gather information, charming to gather information, investigating to gather information. They're usually to gather information. And
yes. And I think this is another one where we kind of have to tie ourselves back down to risks and resources. All this risk and resource and reward, I guess we have 3 R's right there, right? Risk, resource, reward.
Yep.
Are all things that are going on there. So I think whenever you have a social encounter, it's the number one thing you should have whenever having a character that's important that your players are trying to get something from is, what does that NPC want?
Yep. Who is that?
What do they want?
What does they want? Guard just wants an easy shift. They don't want any trouble. Do not make them fill out the paperwork. They do not want it. Or guard super bought in to their role and their importance in it. So they are touchy and they're going to be on the lookout for shit because that guard happens to be the guard that like believes in the cause that they decided to become a guard. They wanted this life. And it can even get all the way down to like, you know, like a merchant wants you to buy things. So they're going to haggle because they want you to buy things. Or if you're just talking to a generic shopkeep, like a baker or someone that sells like natural herb remedies and stuff.
An
apothecary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe they're like, oh, so and social encounters are a great tool to live to I think social encounters are probably the best place to seed hooks towards other encounters.
Yes.
But I also think that people forget to make social encounters risky or to make them use resources.
Yeah. And it's the kind of thing where, especially in systems that have a mechanic that is in some way, and there's a big discussion about this in D&D, is that D&D doesn't really have a lot of like social mechanics, and it sort of does in the way that there are
social skill checks.
Yeah, it has a skill check, but it's one mechanic, and
I think I mean, to really become a social role-playing game, it needs to have resources that you spend in social play.
And so I think that if you're in a game like that, which is the most common role-playing game, right? If you're in a game like that, what, like you saying, you know, what does the NPC want? I think the more important thing is that oftentimes there's not a lot of risk in social encounters. There's the risk of if you're trying not to be found out, the deception risk, there can be a high risk there. But in general, oftentimes a lot of social encounters don't have a lot of risk. So when building a social encounter, you have to define what is the appropriate risk that you could apply to this social encounter for it. A great example, using purely D&D, the least social mechanic thing. You're playing a bard or a paladin, face character, right? Charisma driven. A bard or a paladin, or sorcerer, I guess. And you're asking questions about something that happened around town. You roll really low. The typical response from your average GM or DM, not everybody, is going to be like, this person buttons up, they don't want to talk to you, or they just don't like the cut of your jib or some such, and you don't get the information. And so it's a failure. But that's essentially saying, you failed, move on. That's all that's really doing.
And we know how much we hate that.
We don't like that. So what you instead do is the bard goes, and the bard goes, they ask the bartender at the tavern something, they get a nat 1 or like a 7 or something like that, and they don't just not like them, right? Then when you order an ale at that same tavern while you interview people, suddenly you as the GM are like, constitution check. And it's because they didn't like them, they served you a spoiled ale. And so now you might be not poisoned to death, but you might have a disadvantage on skill checks because you've been poisoned because you failed the social encounter. And you start thinking, and that's a pretty low risk one, but it still makes the subsequent challenge. And then the party might be like, okay, well, you're rolling with disadvantage now, so your bonus, especially if you're not super high level, is not enough anymore. We're going to move over to the barbarian asking things, and then that gives that player a fun time to be able to ask characters in a barbarian way on how to do it. Same thing with intimidate. You intimidate someone, you succeed at the intimidation check, they give you the information, but you're so intimidating, other people walk by and notice, and somebody goes, hey, what are you doing there? And suddenly it becomes a problem, because now you're just a threatening person in an alley, or something like that.
There's that portion to it, that's a big part of it.
That's increasing kind of the risk of choice.
I feel like one of the things that can happen is our characters have roles, right?
Yeah.
That they play in the party.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the biggest critiques of martial characters is that they don't have a whole lot to do outside of combat, and ironically enough, they don't have a whole lot that they specifically even do in combat other than attack.
Hit it. Hit it and take the damage, baby. That's what you're for. You're basically a sword and shield.
But I would encourage you to be like, one, as the DM, you can be like, maybe they're trying to talk to someone who has a fucking high wisdom score, and he knows what the game, and he sees this party roll up into the shop, and then the sweet talking bard steps up and is just like, I'm gonna butter you up and I'm gonna get what I want from you. But this guy's just like, I've seen 1,000 adventuring parties in my lifetime, and I know you guys a dime a dozen. I don't want to talk to you. I want to talk to your fighter friend over there, the guy who actually looks like he knows how to be in a scrap.
Perfect. So you now set the party on its back foot.
Yep, you set the party on its back foot, but you also maybe have the part, like, if the fighter leans into it, suddenly you don't always need to have a roll of a dice for social encounters.
Nope.
I don't think it's always a good idea to have a dice roll unless a player is struggling with role-playing moments, and you can give them that moment as the tool as a way out. Because I think if your players make a really compelling argument,
just give it to them.
Just give it to them. Another thing I want to tell fighters out there: it doesn't matter if you're a knight or not. In the time of fantasy settings, honor is a big deal, and being insulted is a big deal. And you just might be like, why don't we step outside? Or if you're a bit higher up on the social platform, you've sullied my honor with your disrespect.
Yep.
I challenge you to a duel. And it could be that duels in your setting are not necessarily to the death, but that it could just be to like a yield.
Yield. I bet you clearly in combat.
To be like, oh, I want something from you, and you're refusing to get it from me. I'm going to challenge you to a
This
duel.
is a bit more of a story conversation, a little bit, and a world building conversation, and just a tip for GMs in general. But also remember, people, you can call it who would drink a beer with you. And so your NPCs, and knowing what they want, you also want to know who they like, right? A blacksmith is going to have no time for a wordsmith. They just simply don't have time for that. And so if the blacksmith is in your scenario, it's like, I don't want to talk to this guy. I want to talk to them. They know what they look like they're doing. And then you just give them that. You remind the party that even though there are mechanical reasons that have skill checks for things, you can make a very compelling argument that no matter how much charisma you lay on someone, or how much deception you give them, they just don't like that kind of person. If somebody's playing a effete, sort of wealthy, upper crust person, a lot of working class is not going to want to give them the time of day. Other working class might simp aggressively for them in hopes that they get money out of them. But like, you need to make those decisions and spread that love around the party. I realize something that I do that I'm just realizing now that I'm a big proponent for. Your game mommy loves to split the party. I love to split up the party. I think splitting up the party is awesome, and there's a couple reasons I like splitting up the party.
As long as it's only 2 groups, I don't think you should do more than 2.
2 groups on most party, 2 groups in general. But I love splitting up the party, and the reason I love splitting up the party or having the party at different locations doing different tasks is because it does 2 things. It gives me the choice as the GM on what kind of social encounter that much more limited quantity of people must overcome. Because if those people are like, yeah, we go this way, and the other people are, we go this way, and the bard goes in one direction, I put the person that needs to be deceived the most in not that direction. So that I can make it challenging and fun.
You want to balance that.
You want to balance that. You want to give them...
Because you want to give the bard someone to deceive, obviously, because they put their spoons in it. They put their
you want to give them, but they're gonna have that a bunch of times, very naturally when the party's together. They're gonna seek it out.
Naturally seek it out.
And so give your other players the reward. Like, how amazing would it be if you have a pretty retro classic party and the fighter has like no charisma and everything, and they gotta get up to that, and the fighter tries to like deceive someone, and if they succeed at it, what a win. What an outside baseball win for the fighter. And if they don't succeed at it, what a hilarious moment you can have at the table and a consequence for not succeeding at it. Or maybe the fighter player is going to be like, I'm not going to deceive him. I'm going to physically threaten him. Or maybe the fighter player is like, I'm not going to deceive him. I'm going to come straight. I'm just going to come straight down the line on this person and see if that works, right? Like,
really think outside the box too, though. I like this one. Like the fighter, like, blacksmiths 1 are, or that kind of character, that kind of working class character. Mm. Probably has a lot of pride in their physical prowess too.
Yeah, they should.
So it might not be that your character challenges them to a fight, but maybe in like their way to try to endear themselves to this person, they could challenge them to some sort of physical competition. Or a game of some kind in which they're both putting their physicality on the line as part of the game. Not everything needs to be the bard coming in with the face skill, and not every social encounter needs to be a charisma check.
No, it doesn't. Perfect example, by the way. Another thing you can do as a DM to hard seed this. So they walk in the blacksmith, right? Blacksmith, obviously, before rolls even happen, shows distaste for the well-dressed bard, right? They just do. Right? Mm-hmm. Because of their chosen profession, right? And everything. So they show that and everything. As your party walks in, you describe that the blacksmith is like aggressively sweating away and seems to be stammering a little bit and a bit overwhelmed and distractive. An insight check, which is inevitably going to happen the moment you mention anything off keel about an NPC's behavior at every single party. Insight check reveals that it looks like the blacksmith has too much work going on right now, and then on asking about it, you find out that their apprentice has become ill, and that they have an order due, and that somebody needs to, and they're worried that they're going to get it done. Now you've opened an opportunity for your strong martial characters to come in, roll what they're good at, what they've put in spoons on, and the social encounter had nothing to do with charisma. It had to do with wisdom, and it had to do with athletics or strength or whatever the thing is, or maybe even sleight of hand decks, right? Like it had, and so you've created an opportunity where you're creating it's the same thing. You've won over an NPC. This is a classic face character situation, but you've shifted it a little bit to give room for your other characters to shine sometimes. Your face character is still going to do most of the talking, but because usually the player is that kind of player. But
now, I will say this. We also have to talk about the risk of failure in social encounters.
Yeah.
The risk of failure in social encounters should also have meaningful outcomes. Now, the easiest one to handle any sort of social encounter, especially when you're trying to get information from someone, is that money talks.
Yep.
It's always an easy out If you want your characters to be able to get the information, but they're rolling bad on their rolls that night, money talks. Money can buy their way past a failed roll. Money can be like, I know I have this information, but because you're not sweet talking me or offering me something that I want, an information, you can just pay me for it. That's simple. It's not terribly exciting, but it is a good way of getting your party to spend a resource, which is important.
Mm-hmm.
Because of D&D and Pathfinder, those games don't really have social resources that you can spend. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's most challenging about creating a good social encounter.
Okay.
And so maybe this is not one I know I have a whole lot of good ideas about.
I've got some great ideas for it. Sorry, I'm reporting some comments. Unwanted commercial.
Did we get something in YouTube?
We got some spammy comments that I'm just reporting.
Oh man, I'm not seeing anything.
Make sure you're set to live chat, not top chat. It's a weird thing. Yeah, so I deleted one and reported a couple others. Anyway,
that's funny.
So let's talk about social consequences. I'm gonna have to do this in context of common social scenarios, right?
The most immediate one that comes to mind is reputation.
Yeah. So number one, of course, the easiest one is caught in a lie with authority. That's an easy consequence to lead to, right? You're trying to lie to authority. It makes them suspicious. They have the power to create problems for you. Everyone knows that. You try to trick the guards, and then 9 times out of 10, it leads to a fight. And everything. Now let's talk about other consequences. You're a bunch of adventurers, right? You need to put up barriers to adventurers being trusted everywhere. I'm not saying everywhere all the time. I'm saying that some areas might have had bad experiences with random groups of people wandering into town with significant power and money and fucking up shit and then bouncing. And they may have rules about that shit that are extremely restrictive, like you don't get to carry your weapons around. An immediate social consequence. You know that you need to find information on who you suspect is the big bad in this town, but the only way you get to be in this town is that you have to give up your weapons, your spell focus, all of your potential equipment, and the town is overwhelmingly prepared to force that upon you. And so then you have, or maybe they're not prepared, and then your characters have to make the moral choice of just a town trying to defend itself and how big of bullies they are, and then we circle back to the consequences of making the less ethical choice in those situations and the reputation that will be given to you for doing something like that. So all of this stuff can kind of stack, but even simple situations, like, all right, you come to a town, you go shopping, right? Resource, money, but the consequence, right? So you go shopping and you go out and the potion person is like, I've got 3 healing potions. And so your characters buy 3 healing potions and everything because they have the money for it. Great. They've got a lot of money. They're going to buy those potions. So they buy those potions and everything. While they're in that town, have something bad happen to someone. They fall off a roof. Maybe it's a kid and everything. There's no doctor there. The kid's going to die. If only they had magical healing potions left, but your adventurers have purchased all of them. That's a social consequence. That's a moral choice in the situation where they spent resources, and now you're asking them, do you want to spend resources again that you already spent resources on?
Of course, if your players bite that hook and save that child, they should be rewarded.
Yeah, then
it's really important that they get rewarded, that comes around to them at some point, that them saving that child gives them a boon.
And it doesn't have to be immediate. Although I would suggest early on you give them immediate rewards so they know that you're the type of GM that allows them to succeed, that allows them to make choices without it necessarily punishing them for doing the right thing, or doing the kind thing, I should say. But
I also have another thing to kind of talk about where we talk about the consequence of failure. Often, we talk about another thing we talk about, money is easy, is an easy way around a problem. A failed, like we've also mentioned this in other situations. A failed roll is a gateway to a hook. And so you need something from someone. That NPC has what you want, be it information, be it an item.
Whatever. Yeah.
And let's say they have the means of keeping it from you. Let's just say that you can't just break into their house and steal the shit.
Yeah.
They have the means of keeping this from you. Well, suddenly you now have a hook for they need you to do them a favor. And now you have a new quest. So let's say you know at any point that's like a really good way of, let's say you have an encounter or a dungeon or a mini arc you want to throw in. You can, and you want to fit that in the middle of your grand overarching story of epic proportions. Have your players meet someone who has a piece of information, and then have a little side quest.
Yep, and I want to give you another failure encounter too. God, you're getting me. You're getting my juices turning with this whole social failure encounter. All right, so this is a common one, right? Go in. You're going to a merchant. You want to buy something. They have one of that thing, right? Mm-hmm. So, your characters have their preferred weapons and everything like that. And so, and that sometimes they just want to buy their slightly better version of their weapon that they have. That's common and everything. It's like, oh, I see in this town the weapons are stronger. It doesn't make any sense in the real world, but whatever. To just always have the weapons get better as they journey forward. But it's a game. But anyway, so they go to the merchant to buy the weapon. The merchant's like, it's this price. Maybe they roll an insight check to see if that's a fair price, or they just ask you, hey, my character would know if this is a fair price. Is that a fair price? And you're like, yeah, but then they get greedy. They want to negotiate it down a little bit. Maybe they're a rogue or a bard, and they've got good charisma to, in theory, persuade someone. And then they roll poorly on that persuasion, right? Maybe they roll poorly on that persuasion. Normally, 99 out of 100 times, most GMs would be like, no, that's the price. Or if they roll really poorly, they're like, if you keep, or for negotiating, it's this much more, right? And everything like that. But here's the deal. What if they roll poorly? And then the person, ties right back into your thing. Person is like, yeah, and then their assistant comes out of the back and they're like, oh, we can't sell that crossbow. We promised it to Duke this person at this mansion. And your character's like, well, fuck, I really want that crossbow.
Fuck that Duke now.
Fuck that Duke. I don't want wealthy Duke to get it, right? And now you've created another plot hook of they're like, try to sell it to me. They can try to convince the person. Maybe they do convince the person and they sell it to them. And then inevitably, the merchant tells the Duke, this wandering adventurer. And the Duke's like, what did they look like? And inevitably, they're like some sort of magical winged half hippo creature, because this is modern roleplay we're talking about here, and it's mostly furries, or some extremely extravagant
as
bard.
As an old school DM, as an old school player, I'm like, no.
Or there's
somebody furries.
There's some bard with a musical instrument that doesn't exist in that time period, right? That kind of thing. And they're like, oh yeah, it's a bard. They're dressed really fancy, and they've got this really unique tuba that they play. It's this big giant horn that they have to like surround themselves with, right? And everything. Yeah, the Duke's gonna know. New plot hook, right? It's the fact that even with whether they're successes or failures, having weird social consequences to things and training your players that they need to think about the fact that their actions exist in the world and everything. Because like if you tell them, oh, it's dedicated to someone else, and then they're like, well, I want it anyway. Well, then, yeah, you got to convince the merchant to sell it to you or steal it from them. But then you knew that it was going to someone else and that person was expecting it. And if it was a Duke, they probably have resource or recourse to get back the thing that they already...
I think we've kind of touched on a really important piece here, and that social encounters are the means to hooks to all other encounters.
All other encounters, every encounter, including other social encounters. They're the backbone of how a lot of lore is delivered. They're the backbone about how they're the backbone about how to move the plot forward. They're the easiest Deus Ex Machina that feels the least bad to introduce. And at the end of the day, it's why when you have social encounters, in the way that traveling is so very rooted in tables, in my mind, it's so very rooted in encounter tables and random shit coming up because it feels like the perfect place for that. Social encounters are 100% the opposite of that, where it's like, this is where you put your hooks in. This is where you craft shit that matters to your world, or at least that part of your world, if not the main A-line plot that you're doing, and it like affects the world and everything because you have characters that can emotionally interface with players on the same verbal level as them and everything. It doesn't matter. You know, some of your players have spells to control people and everything, but for the most part, most of the conversations are essentially equal footing. And
let's also point out that a lot of these spells are these character manipulation spells are one, have very negative after effects of the person realizing once the spell ends you've been fucking with them. So you got to be very careful about how you said spells. And two, using that spell against any sort of higher, more powerful individual is very unlikely to succeed and then have immediate negative consequences.
Yep, it's so good. So social encounters are the hook builders of your campaign. Combat encounters are deceptive because their initial goal.
We have like
what?
We have like layers. We have layers of we have an encounter pyramid.
Yeah, an encounter pyramid, and in the encounter period, your combat encounters are the heightened risk sections of your game. And by combat, I literally mean anything that relates to your characters getting physically involved with something in a very physical way, right? In a very threatening way. Endangered life. The resource that's up for grabs is hit points, and in some cases reputation. But combat encounters can do that. Traveling encounters are where surprises live, and where variety lives. And exploratory encounters are absolutely underutilized, and for lore reveals, for education, for mortal threat, and everything. And all of these encounters sort of build on each other. You can use an exploratory encounter to reveal a makeshift graveyard somewhere deep in the woods with like a necklace. This happens all the time in open world games, with like a necklace and a little note on it. And then they get to the next town and someone who the note's addressed to is in the town, and you recovered that necklace, and the necklace is valuable, but you can choose to give it to the person who is going to give it to them as their engagement gift and everything. And then that might reveal some information about the bad person in that town that you need to shake down in order to investigate the general that has a secret plot to kill the... Like, it all can tie together, all because of an exploratory encounter that didn't have a definite, clear, obvious connection to the whole thing.
And I also want to point out to anyone who's been able to listen to this, I came to this completely unprepared. This is just us bullshitting off the top of our heads. You can bullshit your way through this stuff, you know? And here's the thing. You're going to bullshit your way through it. Sometimes it's going to work and make sense. Sometimes it's not. It's mostly going to... To you, it may not make a whole lot of sense. It's probably going to... Your players are probably going to be more willing to suspend their disbelief than you might think.
Yeah, it like... There is no GM on the planet that hasn't been like, oh, and then I gave them a treasure, and then later that day, the next day, weeks later, is like, oh yeah, I remember when they did that. Oh shit, I could use that for this.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just gonna use that for this. And even if they, it's hard to go fully double back retcon, like opposite 180 retcon. But if your party didn't do like a detect magic, and you just said you just have to bullshit your way into, suddenly you feel kind of glowing in your pocket at this night on the first full moon since you found this necklace, right? And everything, and you're just like, oh, yes, that was the play. And you can lie to your players if you're that kind of person and be like, that was the thing. But most people can just be honest and be like, no, it wasn't, but I thought it'd be cool. And your players would be like, it is cool. I like this. You did a thing. And so you can have no plan for it on the random dice table and then later discover it's perfect for the actual plot. And you just, you don't, it's not a retcon so much as it is a reveal of something that you didn't plan for, but had in the toolbox of everything. Because you're making that up as you go anyway. And so you're doing that all the time. And so why not with those things? But yeah, so encounters are neat. And encounters are neat because the biggest thing for an encounter to be interesting is that your players get clever at solving them.
The more we talk about it, the entire game at every level is a series
essentially
of encounters.
Yeah.
The entire game is essentially encounters. There may be moments in the game where there aren't risks, and we've talked about that with where even the tools we use to build encounters can then lead us to things that aren't necessarily quote unquote encounters, where there isn't really anything on, like any stakes being on the line. On the hex crawl, you have a discovery of no consequence to the health or livelihood or the story, but just something that populates the world and makes it feel alive. Mm-hmm. It's not really an encounter per se, but it is something. It is something that makes the world feel like our regular world and breathing and and so at that moment it kind of breaks that whole not everything needs to be risk reward or consequence, but it is it's all the game is just these layers of these systems, but it is important to let your players also have those moments of just like having a good time.
This is why
for the sake of it.
I am such of a fan of encouraging GMs, DMs, and storytellers to plan less of their campaign.
Right.
Because you are more than likely going to do all of these, like, how did action A get me to action B, get me to action C, to get me to the bullet point I had later. You're more than likely, if you're not planning in between, to do that and make all of your players' choices matter and think about what they did last time and how it affects what they do this time. You're more likely to do that if you don't heavily plan out things, because you're not going to ignore what actually happened for what you want them to get to. You're going to be like, oh, they've gone here. And again, it's clear. I always knew that I was going to push your party around push your party to a situation where they had to decide if they went into Naden Platts. But it was always a decision. They didn't have to go there. I knew what Naden Platts would be, a bad place filled with bad Underdarky type things.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. That's all I knew. And everything like that. And so the fact that the party got an airship first. What?
Oh, I had something in my head and I lost it.
Yeah.
Give me a second, it'll come back to me.
Yeah, but the fact that the party got an airship then put me in a thing where it's like, oh, it'd be kind of cool if they could somehow take this inside of a mountain. I'll just make that into the plot of the next area they're going to in the airship to get back the god that's been kidnapped, that also happens to be a potential spot that uses. And then I'm going to use all this plot, and because I was using all that plot there, I was like, oh, I'm going to fill in this gap of the history of the world that I've never really. There's a heretical war, but like, how did we get there? And what was it? And everything. And I'm going to do that. And it's like, oh, I've always kind of had the modern pantheon of gods, but we're not there yet. And everything. How do I get them to meet those people? And all of that was just me filling in gaps of having things and being like, well, where are they? And what do I want to put in front of them that's different than what they just did?
It makes me think of, to kind of segue into this other thing, that this idea came back to me. Was I know there are DMs who like different aspects of being a DM.
Yeah.
Some people really like to design. Some people really like to build dungeons.
Yeah.
Right.
Those people are heroes, and they should be rewarded.
Yes. But I also want to, to people who like building dungeons, one of the things you can do in designing your dungeon is you don't have to necessarily stick to a visual idea of the dungeon while designing it. So let's say you build out your dungeon, you draw out your maps, you put your monster encounters together. Don't necessarily stay committed to what that dungeon looks like aesthetically and what those monsters look like aesthetically. Because you could then take that dungeon and drop it in whenever the fuck you feel like it is time to fit that in. And so that dungeon, that grid could be the inside of a castle or a network of caves or like a bizarre library of a haunted library of some kind,
Yeah.
And none of it requires that it be a specific aesthetic.
Yeah, the only thing for a dungeon is that the only requirement for a dungeon is that once you're in it, you got to figure out how to get out of it. Or once you're in it, get to its end
what
point.
You want from
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Get what you need from it.
Get your goal, and then get back out, or figure out how to get out of it, maze style. But like, that's really it. You could do a dungeon that's a walled city, and then you have and really begin to heavily flavor the problems as dungeon-like problems, but flavor them as city scenarios. And everything. A really dense walled city that's kind of overbuilt on itself.
Yeah, that makes me think of a book that I backed on Kickstarter, which I'm looking forward to. I think it actually comes out soon. It's called Into the Sesson Citadel, which is similar to another book I've shown you before, the Into the Weird and Wild. And Into the Weird and Wild is about doing forests as dungeons. It's about just making the woods the dungeon. And Into the Sesson Citadel is pretty much that as well.
Yeah,
making the woods the dungeon.
I'm looking it up here, just because I needed to look it up. Huge stack city in China. So so China has various cities that are like really dense and overpopulated. It's got the famous one where it's just stacks and stacks and stacks. It doesn't even look real. It looks like a cyberpunk game, where it's got stacks and stacks. And then Brazil has or Rio de Janeiro has the favelas. Districts, which you've seen in movies where it's all those like different colored little shack houses that are just like on each other going up and down like hillsides. That's a fucking dungeon. That's a dungeon to get through. You're going through people's residences or abandoned buildings or shops or restaurants. There's people hunting you. There's threats that you could just run into. You could be traveling down some kind of broken down bridgeway and you fall into it, right? Like, there's all kinds of shit. Some cart could just back up and wall off your main path, and you got to go rooftops to figure it out, but the rooftops aren't sturdy and some of them might fall. You might fall through. Like, that's a dungeon. It's a dungeon. And so when you're thinking dungeons can be in woods. As Brandon said, dungeons can be wherever they want to be. If you're a big fan of one aspect of GMing, which is perfectly fine, and of course you're going to set up with your party and what kind of campaign. Maybe you just love designing or like beat 'em up combat. You love tactical combat. That's what you want to play, right? and everything, that's fine. You can do that and make the combat mortally dangerous every time and have them have to get real clever with their skills to not just die every combat. That might be your thing, and that might be the party's cup of tea, but most parties want variety. Most parties want different kinds of encounters, and getting good at different kinds of encounters makes you better at all kinds of encounters. Every time. We should... Oh, go on.
Yeah, we should probably wrap it up. And just a reminder is that, and as you say that last piece, any kind of encounter can bleed into one or the other. You can have a social interaction in the midst of combat.
Please do. I love talking to characters in combat.
Fuck, you can have a combat encounter end because of a social encounter began.
Yep. You absolutely can.
So, don't feel like that these are hardline things that that combat has to end with the enemy being defeated. You know, to kind of touch back on one of the very first things we said here.
Yep, it's not just about. I mean, how many times is it just like, oh, you've killed too many of us. The rest of us are going to leave now. This is no longer valuable for us. Or you've hurt the monster too much. Now it's going to start running away from you. Because it wants to live, because it's not a foolish thing. But nonetheless, that's been encounter discussions, building encounters and breaking down how encounters work in D&D, and the fact that there are D&D, Pathfinder, and again, not just those, Blades in the Dark, fucking Markborg, almost every tabletop RPG is based off of some sort of concept of challenging the players and requiring them to use resources or aspects of their character to overcome those challenges, and everything. And so that's the bulk majority of them. So think of your encounters, spread them out, have fun with them, think outside the box, and also the best way to do it is just to either read a lot, listen a lot, or watch a lot of tabletop, because you will get a lot of ideas from Reddit, from TikTok, from podcasts, from books, different systems and everything that really unlock the way. Or just, subscribe here to Dying of Exposure's YouTube, and you will get more tabletop advice from Brandon and myself the next time we go live. Remember to hit that notification. I'm not going to finish it. I'm just moving on. Nonetheless, for those of you watching the live VOD, hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you learned some things. Feel free to comment and disagree with us. I want to get into those fights on the internet. It's why I'm still on Twitter. For Brandon and myself, this has been Crestboard Gaming episode 5. We'll be back with episode 6 probably in another couple weeks. I think we'll squeeze one in before the Thanksgiving holiday.
I think that makes sense. We'll probably do it on the Monday before Thanksgiving.
Yeah, probably a couple weeks from now. So we'll see you then. Good gaming. Roll with God, or gods, or nothing.
Roll with the homies.
Roll with the homies. Roll with the homies. All right, I'm done. I'm closing the stream. Goodbye.